making the most production with every opportunity. Here I got Chris Ivory, he 15.7 yards per reception. That's awesome. But he only had 13 catches, so not really that big of a value throughout the season, having less than one catch per game. My production prototype is looking for about 430 yards receiving, um, with about 43 receptions or 10 yards per catch. And this is interesting because that 10 yards per catch for a running back is equivalent to my wide receiver. I wanted about 13.75 yards per catch. So there's a different adjustment factor between the running backs and the wide receivers. Um, in my estimation, I really want my running backs to be able to run, and I want my wide receivers to get the most yards passing. I don't expect my running back to be getting me 13.75 yards receiving. And if I take a look on my list, nobody was even close to that. Kareem Hunt, he was over that with 26 catches and 378 yards. So if we could double Kareem Hunt's receptions, that might be the only guy in the NFL who would have done that last year. So, more than 400 yards receiving and on this list. We got Eckler. He had 10.36 yards per catch. Cohen at 10.21. Gurley at 9.8. Gordon was at 9.8. Connor was at 9. Drake was at 9. Johnson was at 8.9. Yeldon at 8.8. And Kamara was 8.75. So these are guys that are actually getting me production all the time. 400 yards receiving at the running back position is pretty good. More than 40 catches. Same guys, basically. Cohen, Gurley, Gordon, Connor, Drake, Johnson, Yeldon, and Kamara. Eckler was fourth at 10.36 yards per catch. Alvin Kamara was 21st at 8.75 yards per catch. And that's only a difference of 1.6 yards per catch. So somewhere in that 8, 9, 10 yards per catch area is where most of these running backs live. And there's Tariq Cohen and James White doing their thing in the pass catching game. On this individual performance metric, I got receptions divided by targets. My production prototype is 43 catches on 55 targets, or about a 78% catch rate. Had a lot of guys here with met that. How many of them had more than 43 receptions? McCaffrey had 107. Elliott had 77. Mixon with 43. Cohen had 71. Nyheim Hines at 63. Connor had 55. Alvin Kamara had 81 catches. Melvin Gordon had 50. And Saquon Barkley had 91. The top 23 running backs had a 75% catch rate or better. And 17 running backs met or exceeded my 78% standard. Who had more than 55 targets? Dion Lewis had 67. McCaffrey 124. Elliott 95. Mixon 55. Cohen had 91. Hines, Connor, Kamara, and Barkley. So basically what I want to know is, do you catch the ball when we throw it to you, and do we throw it to you enough to matter? On this slide, we're looking at the individual performance of the players' touchdowns and divided that by the team's touchdowns. What I'm looking for a running back catching the ball, if you can get me 3 touchdowns in the passing game, that would be great. I'm looking for about 32 from everyone on the team. So that would give me about a 9.4% market share down here. And that's my adjustment factor to weight these things equally. How many teams passed for more than 32 touchdowns? Kansas City, Atlanta, both LA teams, and New Orleans. So out of that, Hunt and Coleman had 14% of their market share. Gurley and Gordon had 13% in LA. Kamara at 12%. And Eckler was at 9%. So I'm looking at 9.4, so all of those guys are doing well on teams that pass the ball a lot. Running backs on teams with under 32 passing touchdowns. You got Yeldon. He had 4 touchdowns, but they only had 15 as a team. White at 24. McCaffrey at 21. David Johnson at 20, Drake, Cohen, Barkley, and Elliott. They didn't pass the ball very often for touchdowns, so that helped get their percentage rates higher. Here's Kenyon Drake and Dion Lewis. So, market share items. We're looking now at how many receptions did a running back have divided by the team attempts. I'm looking for my running back 1 to have 43 catches on 512 passing attempts by my quarterback, or about an 8% market share. I'm going to spend most of my time throwing to tight ends and wide receivers, not so much to the running backs, but just kind of spreading the wealth out here. Christian McCaffrey, he led all running backs with 19% market share of the Carolina Panthers. Barkley and Kamara were about 16%, tied for second. White and Elliott, third place at 15%. Cohen and Lewis, 14%. Kenyon Drake was in eighth place at 12%. Gurley, Yeldon, Johnson, Hines, and Gordon were at 10%. That takes you 9th through the 13th. And that's where you get to my prototype running back, and that would be James Conner, Mike Davis, Austin Eckler, and those are my prototype 8 guys, and that was 14th through 17th. Market share of the team. Player targets versus the team attempts. I want my running back to get 55 targets out of the 512 attempts, so it's basically 11% market share. Previous slide, I was looking for 8% of the market share in receptions. Here I'm looking at 11% of the targets, so that's basically that catch rate. McCaffrey had twice as many targets divided by the team attempts at 22% than my prototype wide receiver 1 has 24% of market share. So if I'm looking for a top wide receiver, I want to throw the ball to him about 24%. McCaffrey got the ball thrown to him about 22%, and I want to throw the ball to my running back about 11%. So McCaffrey's really just a wide receiver 2, I believe. Maybe even a wide receiver 1, depending on your team. There were 14 running backs who had more than 11% market share. That's what my prototype is, so that's very interesting. You may notice that my prototype is not number 1, number 2, or number 3, because those guys are hard to find and you have to pay them a lot of money. I would rather have number 12, number 13, or number 14 and have about the same type of production, get the same number of wins, and pay a whole lot less. Gordon and Eckler approximated my RB1 in this category. White, Barkley, and Kamara all had over 100 targets, and I got them in the 21 to 20% market share of their teams. Todd Gurley had 14%, and there were over 22 running backs who had over 10% of their targets. Here's Nyheim Hines and TJ Yeldon, a couple of pass catching specialists. Here's a market share of receiving touchdowns divided by the team touchdowns. Kind of did a slide similar to this earlier, but it wasn't looking at market share. It was looking at what my prototype was going to be, looking at his 9% market share. Anyway, White was at 24%. McCaffrey was at 21%. My wide receiver prototype would it be at 28%. I want a wide receiver with 9 touchdowns out of 32 touchdowns. And there's McCaffrey up there with 6 out of 28. White's up there at 7 out of 29. So these guys are really utilized as receivers. Here I'm looking at receptions divided by team completions. That's the 43 catches divided by 512 attempts. That's a 12% market share. 15 running backs met or exceeded my standard for RB1. McCaffrey's 107 receptions were 28% of the Panthers' 378 team receptions. Barkley was at 24% of the market share for the Giants. White was at 23%, Elliott at 22%, Kamara and Cohen at 21%. The top 23 running backs averaged at least 52 receptions. Again, my wide receiver 1 received about 27% of the market share of the team completions. And McCaffrey's up there at 28%. Here's Eckler and McCoy. So the player targets divided by the team completions. I want 55 targets out of the 512 passing attempts for 16%. And there is McCaffrey and White up at 33%. Barkley's at 32%. Kamara, Johnson, and Elliott at about 28-27%. You can see the list. They get down here. Connor, Eckler, Davis, and Johnson are about 15%, which is my prototype. Average of the top 19 running backs was 74 targets. So I wanted 55 targets, and they averaged about 74. So we're starting to find running backs to throw the ball to, like Mike Davis and Kerryon Johnson. So I'm going to take all of the individual performances, add those together. For my prototype, it's 100% times 4, gives me 4. McCaffrey was at 6.03. White, Yeldon, Cohen, Drake, and Barkley were over 5. There were 12 running backs that exceeded my prototype of 4.0. And there were 15 running backs that were close enough at 3.5 or greater. So I'm going to use this factor to multiply with the market share factor on the next slide to determine my overall ranking factor. And here it is. The market share for my prototype running back 1 was 8% plus 11% plus 9 plus 11 plus 12 plus 16. You add all those together, you get 0.68. So 13 running backs exceeded my prototype. McCaffrey, you add all of his things together, you get 1.46, which is more than twice of what I was looking for. The most utilized running backs in the receiving games for their teams in the NFL are C-Mac, White, Barkley, Cohen, Kamara, Elliott, David Johnson, T.J. Yeldon, Kenyon Drake. They're all over 1.0. Melvin Gordon did meet my prototype standard at 0.8, and he ranked 12th. So I'm going to use this market share factor, multiply it by a individual performance adjusted factor to get an overall receiving factor. So my prototype was 4 for the adjustment factor. My market share was 0.68. Multiply those two together, I get 2.71. So McCaffrey is the most productive receiving threat running back in the NFL, and the Panthers used him to maximize his talent. His receiving ORF was 8.81. White, Cohen, Yeldon, and Drake are well utilized in the passing game, but how much do they contribute running the ball? That's the thing. If I bring little Tree Cohen out there on the field, it pretty much is signaling to the defense that we're going to be passing the ball to him in some capacity. So we got to figure out, he is really good in the passing game, but do I want to target him 7 to 8 times per game and have him taking big hits? I would like to have him healthy for the entire season, so I'm going to try to use him sparingly and efficiently. Some of these guys that are on this receiving factor list, Barkley, Kamara, David Johnson, Zeke Elliott, Todd Gurley, and Melvin Gordon, they all exceed my RB1 standard in receiving, and I think they did pretty well on the rushing side of the house too, if I remember. What happens when I add that rushing factor and this receiving factor to get my final overall rankings at running back? I'm glad you asked. Here's my prototype, 12.07 rushing at plus 2.71 receiving for a total of 14.77 as my ranking. This is just a total arbitrary number that I've come up with by doing the math, and that's my standard. Saquon Barkley was the most valuable running back in the NFL to his team. The Giants would be worse than horrible without his 26.83. Gurley and Elliott were essentially the same in terms of value to their respective teams at 21.68 and 21.59. There's not a big difference there. David Johnson was the only bright spot in Arizona last season besides the sun. Without him, they would have been atrocious. Is C-Mac a running back who catches, or is he really just a wide receiver who runs? It's hard to tell, but he comes in at the 5th best running back on my list. James Conner and Joe Mixon are not really pass specialists, but they carry the rock, and they show up here on my list at 6 and 7. Alvin Kamara and Melvin Gordon exceeded my prototype at 8 and 9. And that's those 9 running backs who exceeded my RB1 prototype with a 14.77 or better. There were 21 running backs who were over 10. So maybe I can't find me a running back. Let's see over here. I got a receiving factor of 2.71. If I look down my list here, Kareem Hunt, like I said, he's close. Then you get to Kenyon Drake. So Kenyon Drake would be basically twice as much as I want receiving, but he would be at least enough for the receiving side of the house. And then if I looked over here at my rushing factor of 12, so if I had Derrick Henry and Kenyon Drake, that might be the equivalent of having my prototype RB1. That way I can get 2 guys that are cheaper than these guys up here at the top. Speaking of which, what does that mean for the salary cap? My prototype salary, what I'm willing to spend as a general manager for an RB1 meeting all of my little criteria, like I said, I'm not looking for a top 1 or top 5 running back to have on my roster. I'd rather spend that money elsewhere on offensive linemen, defensive players, my franchise quarterback. And here's the reason why. If I average the top 5 running backs' salaries, their salary cap hit in 2019, I look right up here and I average those, it's 4.1%. So that is the most that I want to pay for a running back, is what the top 5 running backs are getting paid. The average salaries for the top 10 running backs, if I go all the way down here to where my prototype is, number 10, their average is only 2.6% of the salary cap, or about 4.8 million. So you could get a guy from 5 to 9 and pay about half what you get from 1 to 5. And the drops are precipitous. In 2019, on this list, I don't have Melvin or Le'Veon Bell on this list because he didn't play last year. So I can't utilize his numbers for a team that he didn't play for. So he's not on the list, even though he's making a lot of money for the Jets, which I don't understand, but that's another day. If I look at the guys who actually played last year and what they were able to do for their teams, this list shows that David Johnson is making $9.75 million, and he is the 4th ranked running back on my list. That's great. Saquon Barkley, as I said, with his ridiculous usage in the Giants system, he should be the highest paid guy. So if I take this overall ORF and I divide it by my prototype ORF, I come out with this adjustment of 1.82 for for Saquon Barkley. I take all of these ORFs and divide them by my prototype of 14.77, and that gives me my adjustment factor for payment. So 1.82 multiplied by what I want to pay my running back down here at 1, so he's 1.82 better, so he should get 1.82 more. That makes Saquon Barkley a guy that I would pay $14 million to. I really don't like paying running backs. That's why my prototype's down here. I would rather have a cheap guy at $7 million, but for Saquon Barkley, all the things that he does, he has earned $14 million. Now, does that mean he's going to get $14 million when he comes up? He might get 25 by the time his contract is renegotiated. But I'm saying last year in 2018, he was worth $14 million. Okay, so Zeke Elliott, he's one of these guys that's on holdout. He is on year 4 of his rookie deal. So the great thing about drafting a running back in the first round, and there's not many great things about drafting a running back in the first round, is that you have the ability to exercise an option year and keep them on your roster for a 5th year. If they are still performing in a manner that you want to keep them around and you can't negotiate, you can then franchise them. That's the whole purpose of getting a first-round running back. So Zeke Elliott is not really supposed to be eligible for renegotiations, and yet he's trying to pull this card. So in 2019, he's supposed to be making $7.9 million. Now, granted, uh, he's the third best running back on my list here, and if I adjust for his ranking, his 21.59, I get this 1.46. So I would be willing to pay Zeke Elliott $11 million just to make him shut up. Just show up to camp. Here's your $11 million. Stay out of trouble. Run the ball. Keep Dak and Amari Cooper healthy. But he's probably wanting $14 to $15 million, and that's why he doesn't have a new contract. So that's the Zeke Elliott story. Melvin Gordon. Where's he at on my list? Here he is at number 9. Melvin Gordon, like I said, he meets my prototype. Here I am. I said I would pay this guy, this kind of guy, about $7.7 million and be happy to do it because I know I'm getting what I'm paying for. He's scheduled to make $5.6 million. He's 1.02 better than my prototype, so I'd bump him up to $7.9 million. I think he's wanting like 14. I know he turned down 10. He was offered $10 million a year, and he's like, nah, no thank you. I'm like, dude, you're barely worth $8 million. I got Austin Eckler to, he's chomping at the bit to take your place. So people are going to always think that I'm being Scrooge with the money. My adjustments pay players for what they're worth. If you look at the top 10 running backs, their average salaries, like I said, was 2.6% of the salary cap. Using my adjustments and looking at the total worth, what they bring to the field and their market share to their teams, I would basically be paying 5.4% of the market share to those top 10 running backs. Why? Well, you got guys like Connor, Mixon, Kamara, Lindsey, Mack, Carson, Jones, and Cohen, and they all make under $1 million. Little treat Cohen down here, 0.4%. Aaron Jones, 0.4%. Even Nick Chubb is at 0.9%. Running backs don't get paid because it's a young guy getting drafted. He plays 4 or 5 years, he gets hurt, and then you draft a new one. There are very few guys like Saquon Barkley who come in and do this sort of thing. And that's why you got to pay Saquon like $14 million. Todd Gurley, he's at 9.2, and everybody made a big thing about his contract last year. It is crazy to think that he's got arthritic knees and he's not going to be able to really make the rest of the money on that contract. So here's the question: do you overpay? Keep your guy that you know, hope he doesn't get hurt, or do you just redraft and try to find the next? That's really all I got. Thank you for listening to my long dissertation. It took me a while to put all these numbers together for you. You can fact check me. Go to either overthecapotc.com or Sport Track. They have all these salary numbers up there for you. And you can go to ESPN or NFL.com and get any of these statistics. Again, I just wanted to say, put some pictures in there